Most people look at a modern farm and see a picture of quiet, steady progress. We imagine a slow evolution of technology, gently taming the wild. But that is a myth. The real story behind America's iron giants is one of radical risk, brute power, and a century of relentless reinvention. The history of the American tractor isn't just a catalog of machinery, it is a chaotic chronicle of engineering gambles. It is a story of inventors who risked everything on ideas that either revolutionized civilization or failed spectacularly. From steam-powered leviathans that shook the earth to hydrogen experiments that came decades too soon, this is the history of the iron giants that conquered the land. Our story begins in 1904, in an era where farming was still defined by the endurance of flesh and bone. If you wanted to plow a field, you were limited by how much a horse could pull before it collapsed. But then, the Case 150 thundered onto the American prairie, and it changed the definition of power forever. To call the Case 150 a tractor feels like an understatement. It was a mechanical monster. Company records from the time rated it at 150 horsepower, meaning this single machine could outpull a team of 40 horses. The engineering was deliberate and aggressive. Case engineers took a massive locomotive-style boiler and slung it low between the axles. This kept the center of gravity down, allowing the Titan to navigate uneven terrain without tipping over. It carried massive water tanks holding nearly 20,000 gallons, allowing crews to run for hours without stopping. At the time, a standard horse team might plow 2 acres a day. The Case 150 plowed 20 to 30. For over a century, modern historians debated these numbers. They seemed too high, too mythical. That debate finally ended in 2018. Restorer Corey Anderson spent years rebuilding a Case 150 from the original factory blueprints. When he finally took the replica into the field and dropped a 50-bottom plow into the earth, the doubts vanished. The machine tore through 25 acres of prairie sod, verifying the statistics from 1904. It was undeniable proof that in the beginning, brute force was the only way to conquer the frontier. But as the reign of steam began to fade, a new enemy emerged. It wasn't just about power anymore, it was about the elements. A tractor was useless if it couldn't start in the dead of winter or if it sank into the spring mud. In the 1910s and 20s, the farmers of Montana and the Dakotas faced a brutal problem. The winters turned the plains into a frozen sea. Standard water-cooled engines were a liability. The water would freeze, expand, and crack the engine blocks. Enter the Rumely Oil Pull. The Rumely engineers took a different approach. Instead of water, they designed a system that circulated engine oil to cool the motor. Oil doesn't freeze. The result was a legend of reliability. The Rumely featured a low-speed, heavy flywheel engine that thumped along at a steady 500 to 800 revolutions per minute. Operator diaries from the era describe these machines running through 3 consecutive winters without a single seized piston, boasting a 90% uptime while their gasoline rivals sat stalled in the snow. But if the cold didn't stop you, the mud would. By 1929, the Massey-Harris GP, or General Purpose, arrived to solve the issue of traction. During the famous Winnipeg tractor trials of that year, 2-wheel drive competitors were slipping and sliding on the slick clay. The Massey-Harris GP, however, introduced true 4-wheel drive to the commercial market. With 4 equal-sized wheels, it distributed power evenly across the ground. This wasn't just a matter of efficiency, it was a revolution in safety. Before the GP, working on steep, wet hills was a deadly gamble. Rollover accidents were common, but wherever the GP was used, accident records showed that rollover incidents dropped by nearly 50%. It proved that grip was just as important as grit. The experimental era. As the decades rolled on, the engineering grew bolder and sometimes stranger. Between the 1930s and the 1950s, the industry entered a phase of radical experimentation. Not every idea found a home in the heartland. Take, for instance, the Ford Snow Devil from the 1930s. Designed to conquer deep snowdrifts and frozen roads, this machine abandoned the concept of wheels entirely. Instead, its propulsion system looked like a pair of giant metal augers, twin screws that spun through snow and ice. On paper, it promised year-round access for isolated farms. In practice, it was a mechanical nightmare. The screws wore down instantly on bare ground, the steering was unpredictable, and the prototype spent more time in the workshop than on the job. By 1935, the project was shelved in favor of tracks. But not all unconventional designs failed. After World War II, as farms became more specialized, the Allis-Chalmers Model G proved that sometimes you don't need a monster, you need a scalpel. The Model G was tiny, powered by a modest 10-horsepower engine, but the genius was in the layout. They mounted the engine in the rear, leaving the front of the tractor open. This gave the operator a perfect, unobstructed line of sight to the implements mounted underneath. For vegetable farmers, it allowed for precision weeding and planting that earlier, bulkier tractors could never match. It was a triumph of niche engineering. By the mid-1950s, however, the obsession with raw power returned. Engineers began chasing efficiency, trying to squeeze every drop of energy from fuel. In Ohio, the Oliver XO-121 became a test bed for high-compression gasoline engines. By using tetraethyl lead, they pushed the compression ratio to a massive 12-to-1. It was powerful, but it locked American agriculture into a dependency on hazardous leaded fuels for another generation. Then, in 1959, Allis-Chalmers offered a stunning glimpse of a future that wouldn't arrive for another 60 years. They built the first practical fuel cell tractor. It was powered by hydrogen, extracted from propane right on the farm. It produced 20 horsepower and successfully pulled a plow. But the technology was too expensive and the membranes too fragile for the rough work of farming. International Harvester even tried pairing with the aerospace industry to build the HT-340, a tractor powered by a gas turbine, essentially a jet engine. While the gauges looked like they belonged in a cockpit and the turbine spun at tens of thousands of RPM, it was simply too thirsty for fuel. These experiments taught the industry a valuable lesson. For the heavy lifting of the world, exotic tech couldn't beat the reliability of the diesel engine. This led to the modern era of mega farming and the final lesson of our story, the danger of scaling up. In 1961, John Deere tried to leap into the high horsepower market with the 8010. It was a beast, producing over 200 horsepower. Expectations were high, but within months, disaster struck. The transmissions simply weren't built to handle the strain. Gearboxes slipped, seized, and failed. It was a humiliation for the company, leading to a massive recall and a complete redesign. It took 17 years for the industry to truly master the art of the giant. In 1977, on the wide plains of Montana, the Big Bud 747 was born. It was not an experiment, it was an answer. Built for the Rossi brothers, this machine remains the largest farm tractor ever put to work. At its heart beat a 16-cylinder Detroit diesel engine, delivering a staggering 760 horsepower. It stood on 8 massive tires, each nearly as tall as a man. These tires weren't just for show, they spread the massive weight of the machine, reducing soil compaction while it pulled implements over 100 feet wide. One operator described the experience simply: it felt like driving a locomotive through mud. The Big Bud wasn't just a spectacle of size, it was the ultimate efficiency machine. It covered more ground with fewer passes, turning raw power into food production on a scale never seen before. Where the John Deere 8010 had stumbled, the Big Bud delivered, proving that the greatest leaps forward often grow from the hardest earned lessons. From the bone-shaking rumble of the Case 150 steam engine to the refined, earth-moving dominance of the Big Bud, the history of the American tractor is a story of survival. It is a story of engineers who dared to use screws instead of wheels, hydrogen instead of gas, and steam instead of muscle. Today, a single tractor can do the work that once required an entire village, feeding over 100 people per machine. These iron giants are not merely tools, they are the engines of civilization, forged through a century of risk, failure, and revolutionary success. The next revolution is likely already idling in a field nearby, waiting to change the world all over again.